Great. Hello and welcome everyone to our seventh Energy versus Climate webinar. My name is Ed Whittingham. And as always, I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, David Keith and Sara Hastings-Simon from cold and snowy Alberta. So what are we going to talk about today? We're talking about nature-based solutions, protecting, mitigating, and when necessary, managing land for environment is good for many, many environmental reasons, but is climate one of them? And are nature-based solutions good climate policy and good public investment? And is it naturally the case? You're welcome for the pun. We worked on that one for days. Or is it just a repackaging of very valid and worthwhile conservation objectives, but through a more modern climate lens? So this topic came about thanks to Elizabeth May. And I say that because we will have Elizabeth on a very future show. We're going to talk about nuclear power. We thought we'd do it today. She's unavailable, but David and Sara, I'm really glad that we did bump it up because it's clearly a hot topic right now in Canadian industry, policy, and even philanthropic circles. And even if what we're talking about is good old-fashioned conservation of different land types. And we're very happy and glad to be joined by a special guest, Mark Tercek, who, like me, is a recovering environmental NGO CEO. But unlike me, he's also a former Wall Street banker, and those two things normally don't go together. So Mark was Chief Executive Officer of the Nature Conservancy from July 2008 through to mid-2019. He is also the author of a best-selling book called Nature's Fortune: How Business and Society Thrive by Investing in Nature. And prior to running TNC at the Nature Conservancy, he had a 24-year career at Goldman Sachs, and that included leading the firm's efforts to develop and promote market-based solutions to big-ticket environmental challenges. So he's going to bring a very useful and interesting perspective to our topic today. So welcome, Mark. Very glad to have you.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks, everybody.
We're going to get to you in just a little bit, just a bit of housekeeping first. As always, please send in your questions via the question and answer box throughout the webinar. Don't use the hand function or the chat box. As always, you can upvote other people's questions if you want. And as always, our esteemed colleague, Mika McFarlane, he is going to screen for live questioners. And if you are willing to be a live questioner, just remember that this is being recorded for posterity. So it's your chance to be part of history. Okay, that's enough from me. Mika, can you launch the poll, please? And we're going to do as we did last week, or 2 weeks ago, when we talked about critical metals and minerals for clean technology. We're going to do a pre and post poll. So you see the question there. Are nature-based solutions, or I think nature-based solutions, are important for tackling climate change and should be supported through policy and significant public spending? And just to give you a hint, we are going to be coming back to this question after we've had a chat amongst us panelists. But before we get to Mark and for some big picture framing on nature-based solutions, David is going to kick it off with just a short primer with a couple slides. So David, over to you.
Happy to do it. And you asked me to throw some shade on trees, and I'm going to attempt to do that, although I personally love trees and hugged them recently. The first lesson is that trees, and indeed all the biosphere, just doesn't matter that much for the climate problem. So what you're seeing here is the total change in the carbon content of the atmosphere in the last 170 years, since 1850. And what you see is that the fossil fuel burning has been the by far dominant contribution to the change in carbon, the thing that's driving climate change. And the net effective land use, land sinks minus land sources, is really small. It's roughly 10 times smaller or more than the total fossil fuel impact. And as fossil fuels grow over the next century, we expect it to be even smaller contributor. So, and it's important to say that this happened during a time where we had really big change in forests. So in the East Coast of North America and the US, the trees have been all cut down for agriculture, and then they've regrown as agriculture moved westward. So we had big shifts in forests, yet the net effect was really small. So the climate problem is driven by CO2 being moved from the geosphere from deep underground by burning fossil fuels where it goes in the atmosphere. But then it can re-equilibrate between atmosphere, land biosphere like trees or soils, and the ocean. And that equilibration happens quickly, and it's mostly out of our control. So what everything that's kind of nature-based solutions does is it shifts carbon a little bit between, say, atmosphere and land biosphere. So if we manage to have manage forest or soil, so we get a little more carbon in it, we're shifting carbon from atmosphere to land biosphere. But it's important to say that that shift can be reversed on short timescales, and it can be reversed by human action, like we decide to cut the forest down, but also by climate change. And climate change can make forests burn, as we've seen in California this year. And that means that if we attempt to reduce climate risks by putting a lot of carbon in forests, we actually may not be reducing risks in some cases because we increase the amount of carbon that can come out of the forests late in the century with climate change. So the risk consequences are complicated. It's important to say that nothing we do with forests and soils moves carbon back to the deep geosphere. There are things that can do that, which I would think of as kind of true negative emissions, some of which involve biomass or trees, but in a different way. So the only things that can really move carbon back to the geosphere, undoing the consequences of emitting a ton of carbon from fossil fuels, are things like biomass that we then put the CO2 deep underground, or air capture where we put the CO2 deep underground. I am not saying these things are necessarily good. Some of them have big costs and environmental consequences, but they are things that actually do the opposite of what fossil fuel burning does. And I think the way I at least think of what trees do is not that they can do the opposite of what fossil fuels do, but that they can shift around over the next century some of the risks. And the big question is how that ties together with conservation.
Great. Okay, thanks, David. I think that's handy framing, including just thinking of the timescales between fossil fuel related carbon and then the carbon that's in the carbon cycle or biological carbon. Mark, we would love to get your take on nature-based solutions, and specifically if you could talk about some of the non-climate benefits to investing to protect ecosystem services and things to do with well-being and livelihoods and flood mitigation. But then we also do want to talk about those climate benefits and, in the context of what David told us about in terms of time scale over perhaps shorter time frames, and recognizing as well, and you could help us to unpack how the recognition of climate benefits can actually allow for protection of nature at a scale in a way that's difficult in the absence of recognizing those climate benefits. So, Mark, take it away. We'd love to hear your perspective.
Okay, well, first, David's overview made a lot of sense to me, and it is important to emphasize right off the bat, as we think about addressing the climate challenge, we need to, reduce emissions to, quote, net zero by 2050, get halfway there by 2030. These are tough jobs, but job number one is eliminating emissions. That means stop burning fossil fuels, stop deforestation, but fossil fuels are where the action is. So I agree completely with David. Now, though, nature-based solutions, achieving those kinds of goals, those are easy to say, net zero by 2050, halfway there by 2030. But of course, none of the pathways are very clear, and none of us can be very confident or optimistic about any of them. I mean, this is a really hard undertaking, right? Maybe the hardest thing humankind has ever tried to do globally. So I think it's good to have all strategies on the table, and nature-based climate solutions can do a lot of good, especially in the near term. But before we get into the climate stuff, thanks for asking about the bigger picture. So we also need to remember that we face an enormous number of environmental challenges, but one is just protecting nature at scale. So I really learned this firsthand when I joined the Nature Conservancy in 2008. In Canada, there's another great organization called the Nature Conservancy, which we partnered with, but there's a little bit of confusion. The one I worked at was headquartered in Washington, DC. We worked in 70 countries around the world, big organization. And we had tremendous success raising capital to protect nature at scale. So even in my early days at TNC, we did $500 million deals, $300 million deals, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, it was really evident as CEO, there wasn't enough capital or enough people or enough political clout on the side of protecting nature. And by the way, why do we want to protect nature? Well, environmentalists like me, and probably some people on this call today, we just think it's the right thing to do. We want future generations to enjoy a natural world equivalent to the one we enjoyed. We think it's the morally right thing to do. I think that's the right reason to protect nature. But regrettably, too few people think that way, and resources really matter, and resources are in demand. So it's important to have additional rationale for why we should protect nature. And then as a former Wall Street guy, I like to think about it as investing in nature. We can think of nature as natural capital or green infrastructure. I didn't invent these ideas. Conservationists and academics were talking about it before I joined TNC. But I tried, kind of like you would imagine a banker to do, to make that more actionable. And that's why I wrote my book. That's what my book is about. And it's actually a pretty good story. In the last number of years, the world is, I think, better understanding that nature is this asset base that does a lot of good things for us. First, it harbors or provides biodiversity. It also provides the clean air and good food we survive on. It provides us protection from storms. It keeps our water supply intact and clean, and on and on and on. And so a lot of my work at TNC and a lot of other great work was done to champion this notion of investing in nature to secure these so-called ecosystem service benefits. One other benefit is nature can sequester carbon, as David just described. And so what I think has really been good to see these past few years is the need to address climate, and to do it in a hurry when it's very difficult to do so, has generated a lot of attention in nature-based solutions. Admittedly, much of the attention is on climate. And it's complex and there are risks. David talked about some of them. But I'll wrap up by saying there's some really exciting stuff underway right now, like the private sector. I live in Washington, D.C., so it's pretty hard for me to be optimistic about federal government these days. Maybe that will soon change. But in the absence of federal leadership in the US, we are seeing private sector leadership. We've been talking about it for a long time, but it's becoming pretty real. I'll use as an example Microsoft. Microsoft, which is great, they're kind of a glamorous global company. They say, they had a good carbon neutrality program. They now say very humbly, they realize it's not good enough. They need to be carbon negative. They plan now to be carbon negative by 2030. Including all scopes of activity, 1, 2, and 3. But for them to feel confident about that kind of commitment, nature-based solutions are important. Now they're transparent and clear about the shortcomings of nature-based solutions. They acknowledge publicly they need to move from avoiding emissions to carbon removal. They acknowledge as well removing carbon from the atmosphere permanently, as David noted, is hard to do in nature-based solutions. And they're out there. They've got a big investment fund. They're working with their customers, and they're creating market demand for innovations in protecting nature. And then in turn, suppliers, entrepreneurial suppliers of nature-based solutions are rising to the challenge. And they're talking about some of these emerging companies. Here is how we can provide you offsets. Here's our strategy for permanence. We also are mindful of biodiversity opportunities, livelihood opportunities, perhaps water or climate adaptation opportunities. And so one result of the interest in nature-based solutions in the near term is going to be the world, I think, is going to become much more sophisticated and able and savvy about investing in nature for a whole range of outcomes. The private sector is going to help accelerate that progress that was already underway with the environmental community. I think in the short run, it can lead to some very good climate progress. In the long run, though, it's true. In the long run, we need to remember what we concluded in Paris. We need to be at net zero emissions in 2050. That will mostly be by reducing emissions. There'll be some need for offsets because some emissions won't go away yet. Maybe nature can be playing a role there. I hope so. We'll also need other innovations, and the Microsofts of the world are driving that too. So that's sort of my big picture take.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. A lot of questions coming out of that. That's very helpful. I want to talk about how do we scale nature-based solutions. I want to talk about the real size of the prize globally and contribution to IPCC targets, how to do it in a timely way, how to pay for it, all those questions. But Sara, I wonder if I can turn to you because, prior to us jumping on the Zoom, we are comparing notes about a point that I think we often get confused or is confusing. And there's a recent portrayal in the popular press up here, Mark, with Canada being net zero, and why aren't we getting credit for all the forests that we have? And that would allow some of our industry to go ahead and unearth fossil fuels and combust them, because look, we've got massive amounts of forests and we can sequester that in biological carbon. Sarah, can you help to unpack that a bit?
Yeah, and thanks, Ed. I mean, I think that's one of the concerns that I have around the way nature-based solutions are being discussed in Canada. I mean, even just into the name, I think the idea that it's a piece of the answer makes a lot of sense, but I think there's a little bit of a tendency to use that solution as this is the solution to climate change, right? And that's that's worrying, because as we've heard from David and Mark, the scale and sort of the permanence of sequestering carbon within nature is not sufficient to reach where we need to be from an emission standpoint. And so when I step away from kind of the technological question around this and just to one of how does this enter into the conversation, I think it's really important that as we're pursuing these and as we see companies that are pointing to them and pursuing them, that we understand what is on the other side of the balance sheet, so to speak. So where is it being put forward as this is something that we should be doing because it definitely, for all the reasons Mark indicated, it makes a lot of sense. But then, in what cases is that then being used to sort of as an excuse or as a reason to delay other action? And I think that's a real challenge that we need to grapple with. And even it goes back to broaden it a bit to the point that Mark was making around this growing interest in treating thinking about nature as an asset, which of course is a very powerful tool, to incorporate it within the kind of economic structure that we use, because we can then, if we see that nature is an asset, we can see also that as we use it and deplete it, that is, a capital stock that is going down. And so that's a very, powerful way to think of that. But again, on the flip side there, what challenges, or to what extent does that open a pathway to sort of actually just do that depletion? Because you say, here's this great asset that I have there. And so this is a topic that I think for me, it brings up a lot of these sort of questions around the broader system that we live in and the way that solutions like these enter into the political discourse. And I think there's a lot of room as usual for good debate and discussion on it. I do think that some of the things that I've seen come out in Alberta in recent times where people say, yes, we have, big forests in Canada, so, haven't we done everything that we needed to do, is a really, risk to both undermine the climate question, but also, the good work that needs to be done around preserving natural capital.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of those points. The communication here is tricky. The government policy is tricky. I've been at this now for about 15 years and have been frustrated by most government efforts. I don't mean to be too negative. Now, it's not like the private sector gets everything right. The private sector makes its fair share of mistakes too. But I do think right now there's a change underway, and the private sector leaders are trying to get this right. And this initiative, the Science-Based Target Initiative, I think is amazing because it addresses all of the points you just made. And something like 1,000 companies have signed up. And they have this very strict protocol that says, they're still working it out. You can probably use offsets in the near term during your transition. And in the very near term, avoided emissions will be okay. But you have to have a very clear pathway toward getting to removal, not avoided emissions. And it needs to be long-lived, permanent removal. And I think that these private sector initiatives are going to set the tone and address those different concerns you've had. It's a harder thing for NGOs to do because NGOs are in the business, I know firsthand. I mean, I was in this job. You're always trying to win more support, more followers, more money. And so there is a little bit of pressure to perhaps oversell solutions. It's not all bad because it raises awareness of trees as a climate tool, but it tends to get oversold. So now we need a lot more discipline. I hope governments will do this, but I think this Science-Based Target Initiative is a good example of the private sector doing it. And governments can get this right too. Norway is another impressive leader. If you watch how they deploy their capital in places like Brazil and Indonesia to achieve the forest outcomes they pursue in connection with climate. They're very savvy, I think, about providing capital to the extent and only to the extent very clear outcomes are achieved. And it's a lot of capital, so it works to be a pretty powerful motivator. But anyway, you're right. All this complexity has to be addressed. You're absolutely right.
Maybe to sharpen it, I think, to me, the big question right now in Canada, in a way, is how to avoid getting played. So I absolutely agree. There's something truly useful about nature-based solutions and ways we can do something that's for climate and protecting nature. I'm all in. But the catch is obviously that, do I really believe that Trump talking about 1 trillion trees is doing that just because he loves trees? I kind of suspect it's because he loves business as usual.
Right.
And I think the same is happening in this country. And I think that what I want to hear you talk about is how enviro groups and the activist community should position itself to try and get some of the good sides of nature-based solutions without getting played, basically.
Yeah, David, again, great questions. Not easy. I agreed. Trump in the debate last night mentioned 1 trillion trees. So, my God, that might actually reduce the popularity of this strategy. So maybe it'll help. I think the answers are, science-based, transparency, clear, open invitation for criticism. There are a couple of other companies doing this too. Now, they're just not as prominent. Shopify and Stripe, two small tech companies in the US. The dollar amounts.
Shopify would be Canadian, excuse me.
Oh, I'm so good.
Ask any Canadian, I'll tell you.
Mark, I'm just about to hit the Zoom eject button.
And we can go into all the singers that you may think are American that are actually Canadian singers, but we will leave that for another episode.
Touche. I apologize. Well stated. Anyway, these guys, again, really clear-headed. We want to be leaders in doing what we can as a corporate, achieving the climate goals. We want to get our customers, our workers, our suppliers involved. We want to use offsets to accelerate progress. We are aware of all the shortcomings. Here they are. I think it was either Stripe or Shopify. One of the two put out a request for proposals recently for their first offsets, both tech-based ones and nature-based ones. But one of the rules were that if you submitted a proposal, they would all be made transparent, even the ones that were declined. And the critique of them, I think in this case, was provided by Carbon Plan, a good NGO focusing on this stuff. And I just think it's kind of a sea change happening right now in transparency, in kind of hard-headed assessments of what's good or bad, what can be done short-term through these initiatives, where they fail. Another good discussion that I like it's new in connection with nature-based solutions is critics are saying, listen, companies who have your own carbon plans, even if there's not much room for carbon-based solutions in your most ambitious plan, you can still support this stuff because it's climate positive, it's nature positive. You can help vulnerable communities. You can protect biodiversity. So we've got to be aware of the risks and the shortcomings. We've got to hold people accountable. In my country, the US, we have an enormously urgent, overdue need to accelerate the regs that will really allow this to scale up. But broadly speaking, I would say right now, all this debate about nature-based solutions, the pros and cons, the science papers that are saying huge amounts can be accomplished, the critics saying it's not as good, et cetera, it's introducing a new kind of transparency and reality that I think is really going to be great for progress.
I just wanted to come back quickly to the Norway example, because I think it sort of comes actually back to the point that I was trying to make, which is, I think Norway, of course, has done a good job, as you say, of pursuing this in a meaningful way in partnership with other countries that's led to good outcomes. The cynical take on it, of course, is that the government saw that they needed to do something to reduce emissions, and they didn't want to touch their core business, right? They wanted to continue to increase production of oil and gas. So I think that's to me that's again, you could say, well, it's certainly much better than they've done that over the past history. And that we are where we are now because of that. But at the same time, it's good to be, I think, wary of sort of what sits behind that and those alternative motivations.
Well, again, I agree completely. I don't have a glib answer to that on the one hand. On the other hand, though, given the urgency of things, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We have to make progress fast. It's another, I think, benefit of nature-based solutions. Now, the way President Trump talks about it isn't exactly what I have in mind, but I think environmentalists also make an error sometimes by kind of overdoing, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. They're not usually wrong when they set up those demarcations, but it's so offensive to people who are in the bad camp or in the neutral camp. And I think we have to also make it, somehow we have to grow the political coalition for pragmatic climate action. And I think nature-based solutions is a good way to do that. And then the old conservationist in me is saying, boy, we can also now talk about, there's a company called Terra in the US that does forest offsets in a pretty sophisticated way, I think. They use AI and satellite imagery. It's a tech-oriented approach, but they're already weaving into their analysis now the benefits that can be achieved through wildlife corridors for certain at-risk species, opportunities for forest thinning to address fire risk, which of course is a risk to the permanence of the offset. And so while NGOs have talked about these things for a long time and done good project work, these guys are putting together at Terra a toolkit, an analytical toolkit that I think will allow us to really accelerate sophisticated investing with all of these nature-based opportunities in mind.
Great. So Mark, I want to move us and David and Sarah, all of us, to a discussion around what are the good nature-based solutions versus what are the not so good nature-based solutions. We know not every solution is created equally. When we talk about the NBS field, we're talking about protection, restoration, management of land. There are priority landscapes out there. We've got agricultural lands or coastal ecosystems. We've got forestry. We have grasslands, peatlands, wetlands. And up here in the Canadian context, if you're looking at risk lands, starting here in Alberta, you've got native prairie grassland is highly at risk. But then for nature-based solutions, we want to layer in the carbon value. We need to see where that matches up. At-risk landscapes versus protection, restoration, or management that is actually going to create climate benefit. And up here, what I'm seeing is the trend is to really talk about wetlands, bogs, and peatlands, and particularly avoiding conversion of peatlands. And in a very sensitive area or a hot area in Canada would be Hudson's Bay or James Bay lowlands, where we've got carbon there that's been stored up for thousands of years, and pressure from the mining industry and other industries to go in and frankly dig up that peatland and in the process emit the biological carbon that's stored in there. So in Canada, and based on the research, because TNC has done some of the best research on it, should we be focusing on avoided conversion? Should we be focusing elsewhere? What do you think?
Well, again, really interesting question, and it kind of takes us in a different direction. I'm not a biologist or a scientist, so I don't want to overstate my credentials here, but I think the job one is to protect the natural ecosystems we still have. And we want them all. Like at TNC, we were really very emphatic about this. There had been a thought in biodiversity circles, we should protect the biodiversity hotspots, i.e. those ecosystems where there is the greatest quantity of biodiversity. And not a bad strategy. But at TNC, we said, no, we want to protect all ecosystems equally because we need them all. So, certain deserts don't harbor that many in quantity, that much biodiversity, but it's biodiversity we want to protect. But anyway, I think the first thing is to protect the ecosystems that we have. They differ in the amount of carbon that they store, but remember, we're protecting them for a multitude of reasons, not only carbon, but for biodiversity, for resiliency, et cetera. So I would say first, protect what we have. And then second, restore what's been degraded. Because you can kind of follow the same principles and be confident if your restoration is guided by good science that you're not kind of monkeying too much with the way the ecosystem had worked. Where things get more complex, even if there might be better carbon gains to be achieved, is when you go off and create new ecosystems. So new afforestation projects. And then now all kinds of new risks arise that have to be addressed. You could have monocultures that hurt biodiversity, even though carbon is sequestered, or impact water cycles in some fashion, or impact livelihoods. So it gets complex. Doesn't mean we can't figure out those answers. And some of those strategies that are more complicated from a biodiversity or conservation perspective could very well be strategies that, in the long run, are more important in terms of carbon opportunities. The other thing you have to keep in mind, though, with those kinds of strategies is when you're talking about afforestation, that doesn't happen like that. Now you're pursuing a strategy that can't be a short-term strategy because, of course, ecosystems take a long time to grow. There's a lot of interest today, at least in America, which I think is good because, again, we don't have enough people on the side of the environment or climate. So in urban areas, especially where there's some capital to be deployed, and there's concern about sea level rise and extreme weather, there's now better understanding that coastal ecosystems, not always, but often, provide a really competitive, superb tool to adapt to that new threat of storms and sea level rise. And then if you do it in the right way, it can also be a carbon strategy. So there are these win-win opportunities. So it's kind of hard to generalize, I think. You've got to work your way through these options one by one. From a strict climate perspective, we want to certainly eliminate deforestation and other land use sources of emissions. That's obvious. And then if we can restore, that's really attractive from a conservation perspective. We've got to acknowledge, though, that we can't be as confident about the long life of that carbon sequestration, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And we've got a bunch more questions from the audience that I really want to get to. But before we do that, I want to ask you, is scale the biggest Achilles heel when we talk about nature-based solutions? And that is, when we're talking about a world when we need to be removing not just megatons, but gigatons of carbon. To remove a gigaton of carbon, you would have to reforest, by some estimates, the entire land mass of Canada. Versus looking at other approaches like direct air capture, you would take up a footprint that would be the landmass, say, of PEI or the Canary Islands. Yeah. If you're looking at bioenergy with carbon capture, let's take a forest and you turn it into biochar and then you combust that and you capture that, then you're looking at a disproportionately smaller land footprint. Is that the challenge, or is it actually paying for it that's the challenge?
Oh, paying for it's a challenge too. Scale's a challenge, speed, time is a challenge, and always paying for it is a challenge. But you're right to start with scale, I think. So for carbon solutions, it's ones that are small ultimately shouldn't matter. But by the way, it's true for all of the nature protection business. At TNC, I mean, nobody was bigger than us. Nobody did bigger deals. My 11 years there, we kept trying to do bigger and bigger deals. We kept talking about scale because we were in this frantic effort to catch up. On the biodiversity front, under the Convention on Biodiversity, regrettably, COVID has delayed it. Otherwise, it would have been meeting this year in China. The plan is to aim for protecting 30% of the world by 2030. We have a long way to go. But then great thinkers and leaders and inspiring heroes like Ed Wilson say we need to protect half the Earth. So for biodiversity reasons, we need to think big. For climate reasons, we need to think big. It gets really complicated here, and David will probably be better than me on this. I'm not a scientist. A number of scientists a couple of years ago, including ones from the Nature Conservancy, published a paper that said as much as 1/3 of what the world needs to do under Paris between now and 2030 could be done by restoring ecosystems, in a big way. It's all ecosystems. Forest was top of the list, but you name it, they're there. Now, all scientists don't agree with that analysis, but the authors have fought back. I don't really know how to referee that. As a practical leader, I always thought, well, that sounds pretty big to me. We have a long way to go. Let's make as much progress toward that goal as we can. And then if we start hitting constraints, we'll deal with it. But let's not today choose to not pursue that strategy because we don't think it can be quite as big as 1/3. But I don't know. I'm curious what David thinks on this.
David and Sara, you're not going to let the 1/3 stat go. Don't.
Well, so again, with the really big framework of long-term climate risk, which is fossil carbon in the atmosphere, trees don't really change the long-term risk, but short-term risks always also matter. So I think the 1/3 is high, but in some way it doesn't matter. I really agree with what you said, Mark, which is the near-term decision is, should we go hard on both things? Yes. I think the division is also what you said, Mark, that if you're talking about protecting existing ecosystems, it's really clear there's a win-win. When you're talking about growing trees in new places or other new biological changes to get carbon benefit, then there are real questions. Let me give you a clear Canadian one. So it turns out if you plant new forests, boreal forests in the north, it's not clear you have a climate benefit at all. Because on the one hand, you've taken carbon out of the atmosphere. That's a plus. On the other hand, trees are dark. They're especially dark in places that get a bit of snow. So that's a darker albedo. It absorbs more heat. And there have been a bunch of calculations, I don't think they're challenged, that shows that high latitude forests like this are a net bad for climate if you're just talking about total climate impact. So I think we really need to be clear about the difference between protecting and manipulation to push something new that nature didn't do before.
So really quickly on that scale question, so just going back to actually that slide that David showed in the beginning, one of the points of sort of confusion around the scale is often about how much carbon is being taken out of the sort of being sequestered by the trees, and then what that means for the level of the atmospheric carbon, because you lose basically a factor of, I believe it's a factor of 2 in there, because as you lower the level of carbon in the atmosphere, you actually have some that's released from the ocean to get that equilibrium back. So that's one thing that is often coming up in this debate. The other that I would just be, very cautious around is talking about technical potentials, right? That's what I would think of as, saying that you could gain a third from, reforesting or everything basically. You can throw around a lot of impressive technical potentials, right? The amount of energy that we use is equal to what is, comes from the sun on a relatively small patch of earth today. Right. So, again, there you might, then jump to, well, we should power everything by the sun. Right. So I think it's important to understand those technical potentials in saying, yes, that 15 or 30% is maybe large enough to be worth going after, but then realizing that you're going to get so many haircuts when you get from, sort of what is in theory feasible to what you can actually do is just an important kind of scaling factor to keep in mind.
Great. Okay. I really want to get to audience Q&A. I'm going to restrain myself from jumping in on the trees comment because my one editorial comment is we spend far too much time when we talk about NBS talking about trees. They suck grams in the first 10 to 15 years of their lives and not tons. But let's go, and I'm sorry to everyone in the audience in advance if I butcher the pronunciation of first and last names. Let's go to TG Jayanth, who's got a question, and I think Mika, you have TG lined up.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Hi there. Go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Mark, as a contributor and member of TNC, it's great to see you. Very much support the work you guys do. Sara, hi. This is the series that I've been following. You guys do such a fantastic job. My question is this: I was so totally convinced after listening to the debate last night that trees were the way to go. When Trump mentioned it, and you completely disabused me of that notion. This is the question. So the cap and trade program that California has, which I think is a fantastic program, right, gives you credit in a way of making money, both by preserving existing forests and planting trees, right? So it seems on the face of it a fantastic initiative, but listening to what you're saying, does that dilute some of the effort that could potentially go towards, let's say, minimizing methane emissions and getting refrigerants out of the, out of use, which could perhaps have a much more profound impact?
Mark?
I can answer quickly, but I'm interested in everybody else's views too. I'm sorry. I was sort of joking around when I made a comment about Trump's comments last night. And I really don't want to criticize the Trillion Tree Initiative because I think it is additive. It brings more people in. And so I apologize for being a wise guy there.
Your
With regard to
inbox is already
California,
full, Mark, I'm sure for that. Your inbox is already full, but sorry to interrupt.
with regard to California, I'm a fan of the California cap and trade system and its allowance for forest credits. Now, we just have to be honest. There are risks and complications here. But the Nature Conservancy, I guess it closed on this deal after I left, but I worked on it. We did a deal in the Appalachia region of the US. We bought all this land that had formerly been coal land. We're restoring the forests. In part, we're restoring the forest for it to be recreation and hunting and that kind of thing. We could never have afforded to do this without the ability to sell forest credits into California. And so it's a really good example of a project that otherwise wouldn't have happened. I'm sure of that. It's happening in a part of the country where it'll really be useful, I think, to build support for climate issues and nature-based solutions. The program creates jobs for people who used to work in the coal industry. It's all being guided by TNC science and outside science, so I think it will be done pretty well. And so to that, I say hats off to California. Critics would say, yeah, but Mark, what happens if that forest catches on fire or some disease comes and wipes it out? Then emissions will have occurred in California's program that otherwise that shouldn't have occurred, because otherwise those emissions would have been eliminated, or a better offset, some sort of methane in your example offset would have occurred. Yeah, there are such risks, and so then you need to factor in insurance or buffers for these forest programs. It's kind of complicated. But my take is I think it's great that California does that. It's a pretty small part of the program. It's already generated a lot of funding for investments in forests across the US. I think they're now allowing that to happen outside the US too. With all that work is coming a lot of innovation and new thinking. Even in the project I described for the Nature Conservancy, some stuff will probably go wrong. Yeah, we never did a project just like this before. And that gets the wheel turning and progress happens. So I think it's good that California is doing that, but we also have to acknowledge the risks that go with it.
Yeah, and Mark, I want to follow up on that. So with those wildfires, you had a bunch of California LCFS credits, reserve credits, that literally went up in smoke. So it's good that they are reserve credits, and now the obligated parties have to go and seek new credits. But then those obligated parties, I imagine, that say, would never do that again. We're not buying forestry credits. We're going to go with something that just has right out of the gate higher permanence.
I think something else will happen, or I hope something else will happen. It seems to me insurance schemes will arise whereby you can, think about how insurance works. Like if you only have a couple of players, it's very expensive and risky. But when you have these big pools of players, then you can at low cost buy insurance. And so you'll be able, I think, to buy something that will work like insurance, so that if an ecosystem A or B is hurt, there can be a buffer that provides the offset that you were counting on. So that's what I expect to see happening over time. Smart solutions to go after the shortcomings of nature-based solutions. Permanence is only one of them. Additionality is another, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, this is great. Maybe next question.
Oh, I had actually one thing I did want to jump in on TJ's question, which is I think it's really interesting, because to me, this is a question for the nature-based solutions, but it's actually really more a fundamental climate policy question, right? So you're saying, we have these two different options. There's reasons to think this one is maybe better, or that one might be cheaper. What do you do with that from a climate policy perspective? And I think there's one answer, which is very clear, is, you try to design climate policy in a way that is sufficiently ambitious and can ratchet up that ambition if you're able to sort of get to those targets, right? So in the case of a cap and trade, a lot of thinking about what you do with a price floor, with lowering the cap in future years automatically if you find that you're reaching it, so that if the nature-based solutions, for example, does take off in a big way, then you're not you're using that to expand the emission reductions that you're getting rather than shifting them from one to the other. And then it leads also to some questions that I think, the academic community is still really struggling to understand, which are, what kind of things do help improve acceptability of climate policy? And then also, is it better to have, this one big coherent climate plan? Or as, some of Leah Stokes' work has shown, you should throw a lot of different policies in there. And, her idea around the sort of fog of inaction where policies happen. So I think there's still a very live discussion around what is the best way to achieve those desired outcomes. That's not always clear.
Great. Okay. Brandon Villar has a question. I forgot, by the way, our poll 1 results. I think nature-based solutions are important for tackling climate change, should be supported through policy and significant public spending. 3/4 of you agree, about 1/4 of you don't know, and then one lone brave person said she or he disagrees. We're going to come back to rerun this poll in about 15 minutes, but Brandon, over to you.
Hey, so I run a software business, and we actually have a carbon removal budget. When we first spent our carbon removal budget, we actually went with nature-based solutions, given the low cost of those offsets. But since learning more, it's concerning that a lot of companies are spending money on nature-based solutions instead of sending that money to more permanent solutions like direct air capture. Are you guys concerned that maybe nature-based solutions is taking money away from investing in the R&D and maybe the early stages of more permanent solutions, which will make it slower for those to scale up?
Sure.
Yeah,
You know, my take
concerned
is,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead, David.
I'm certainly concerned that the very low-cost nature-based solutions that mostly come from project-based offsets were operating a bit like the old indulgences in the Catholic Church, where you pay a little bit of money and your sins are absolved. And I think the idea that you can now fly in an airplane or whatever and pay a pretty small amount of money in dollars ton carbon, with the idea that that's somehow undoing the carbon consequences of that flight. And I think the answer is it really doesn't in the long run. And to me, what we need to do is start to really think about two markets, where one market is about long-term transfers of fossil carbon in and out. So that's the thing that, fossil carbon drives the problem. And if you have ways to shove it back in the ground by not just direct air capture, where I happen to be involved, but biomass with capture or adding alkalinity to the ocean, anything that's permanent with all the problems you have, then you've really reversed it. Whereas I think you think about nature-based as a separate pool, which is useful, which has these great overlaps with preserving nature, which is a kind of short-term capacitor, if you like, that helps us manage the climate problem over this next half century, but that doesn't undo the risks of taking carbon, fossil fuels and burning them.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, David, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but the question captured this. I think it really is important that there be demand now from the private sector or from government players for nature-based solutions, fine, but for these really important technological-based initiatives that can store carbon on a permanent basis. And it's encouraging because such demand is arising from the companies we've been talking about. And I expect we're going to see a lot of really exciting activity here in the period immediately ahead.
Yeah, and Mark, Mark, David, Sara, is that activity going to be happening in the voluntary market? Is it going to be happening equally in the compliance market? And what do you do with a big price differential? Because if you look at it in compliance markets, the price is much higher than in voluntary markets. And so you would look at that and you would say that the market, when it has a choice, would pay much less for nature-based solutions than when the market is forced into pursuing it as a compliance pathway. And I say that, Mark, because this is a live conversation right now in Canada. We're in the process of implementing a national clean fuel standard that's going to be very similar to the California LCFS. And there is some discussion around this being a compliance pathway in Canada's federal industrial carbon pricing scheme as well.
So I think one thing,
just a sec, compliance pathway with project-based offsets, is that right?
Yeah, so it's not concluded, but it is a conversation. Yeah.
So I think this is this fundamental thing that the transaction in a project-based offset is fundamentally different from a regular economic transaction. Let me just take a second to say this. Like, if I'm selling oranges, Ed, and you're buying oranges, we've got this nice counterbalanced incentives. I want the price high, you want it low, we can settle. And the original cap and trade schemes actually looked like that, because government said, we don't care what you businesses do, but at the end of the year, you only got so many emissions credits. If you don't have the right number at the end of the year, we crush you. Because that was an absolute thing, not relative. But it's important to think how different a project-based offset is. So in a project-based offset, you get money for the difference between what you actually did and what you would have done in some hypothetical that no one can observe. And you have every reason to exaggerate. So in that case, the right way to think about it is, I'm trying to sell you oranges, Ed. You're trying to give me oranges, but this is all under the orange arbiter, Sara, and really it's to both of our incentives to exaggerate the number of oranges. So it's to my incentive to say, I was going to build this just terrible project that had destroyed a huge amount of land or emitted a huge amount of chlorofluorocarbons or some other greenhouse gas, but because Ed paid me this money, I'm not doing it. And then we both have an incentive to trick the regulator, Ed, you and me. We both have an incentive to make that counterfactual look really big. And we know much more about our business than a regulator. So it's really easy for us to mess with, in this case, her, and to exaggerate the total transaction. And that's why the cost is low. I think that's a fundamental problem with project-based offsets that's true both for nature-based ones and for all the other normal project-based offsets or industrial.
But going back to say peatland.
Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that was good. And when I open this up, but going back to the peatlands example in the lowlands of Hudson Bay and James Bay. So let's say you're an indigenous community, you're First Nation there, and you've got a temptation, you've got mining companies that want to mine on your traditional lands, They're presenting a very clear economic incentive to do that. Your economic incentive to not doing that is to prove that there's a threat and then to monetize that through an offset system. And we know that avoiding carbon conversion in peatlands is good. Keeping those peatlands in place for a whole bunch of biodiversity reasons is good. Why shouldn't we allow an Indigenous community to do that?
I think the challenge is the counterfactual accounting. So imagine two projects, one where there's really, really going to be a mine and you actually want to protect the peatlands from the mine, fine. But if Indigenous Group A has that, it's really tempting for Indigenous Group B to kind of cook up a mine project where the truth is there never really was a serious mine project. And everybody's incentives are aligned. The mining people want to make it look like they had one. So everybody gets paid not to do this thing they weren't going to do anyway.
Yeah.
So, and it's very hard to audit that.
I'll come back with a bit of a sort of positive take on,
Mark,
on what these things can do.
Yeah.
I think that the idea of having lower cost offsets in a voluntary market, if you can manage this stuff well, it's like classic marketing, you get everybody to pay what they're willing to pay. Right. And so that,
good argument.
At the end of the day, you have more money flowing into all these solutions, and that's great. Of course, as you say, as in, consumer marketing, you can have a problem when someone who's willing to pay more ends up taking the cheaper option. But I think that is a good guiding principle to think about what we might be trying to do here. And I think there is a really credible claim to make that, especially when you start talking about some of the corporates, that some of these lower cost opportunities can be an on-ramp to more serious action, right? And so you've seen that happen with, certainly on the renewable energy side with Microsoft and others who started out really buying, renewable energy certificates that we might argue today are, not of particularly high quality, but it put them on an on-ramp to actually now directly investing in renewable energy projects, and similar to the asker of this question, if your first move is you're faced with buying into these more expensive carbon removal, you might never get onto the ladder. But if there's a space for you on the ladder with these lower cost options, and then there is a way to make sure people are raising their level of ambition, I think that can be a very powerful tool.
Got you. Mark?
Nothing much to add. Those are great answers, I think.
Okay. Great. Well, let's go to Robert Tremblay. You've got a question and around coming back to Canada, taking credit for its forest and how it factors into to NDCs. So this is going to be a fun topic. Go ahead, Robert.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah. So thanks for the intro, Ed. So basically, the question I had is here, I think I've heard Danielle Smith specifically mention a lot of times that we need to look at Canada's forests as a way to kind of look at, where Canada's actually carbon negative. And I guess my question is that how can Canada take credit for the forests since we didn't really have a role in putting them there? And I guess it's kind of around the additionality of how you look at carbon that's sequestered through forests and natural resources.
Okay, can Canada take credit for forests that it had nothing to do with planting in the first place and say factor that into its NDC? Who wants to take a crack?
Maybe Mark?
Well, I was hoping one of you Canadians would. No, I think it's sort of the same kind of question, right? Like those forests, you're creating this strange counterfactual thing. No, you do not deserve credit for protecting those forests, in my view, going forward. And they do not belong in your NDCs. I don't know what more to say about it. It's almost an offensive question. I mean, we could go that way and we'd have a slippery slope and a spiral into zero opportunity for climate progress. I think the better way to think about it is it's the developed countries that are responsible for putting most of the carbon in the atmosphere. Our developed countries have done varying degrees, very different kinds of levels of forest protection. So Canada is probably at the top. It varies, but we're the source. We're the historic source of the emission. We benefited from that economically. Now there are developing countries or poor countries with forest systems intact. We really need to protect those ecosystems. It does seem kind of outrageous for the rich world to just demand that the developing world do that on their own account. And so it's time for the developed world or the rich world to step up and pay for that one way or another. So in Paris, there were provisions for carbon or climate aid, not nearly as big as they should be. The US is probably lowest on the list in terms of being exemplary here too right now. But that's what I think ought to be happening. And then, you know, it's in those countries where you're counterfactual, David, will be easier to be comfortable with. Like it's quite easy to, well, we see it every day. We can see that the struggle in the Amazon in connection, especially with soy and also with cattle. And actually, it's been a pretty good story. And Brazil has been pretty heroic in my view. They've been assisted by some, you know, enlightened Western companies who have tried to organize their buying power to support better practices. They've been assisted by some philanthropists, aid like Norwegians, and then, you know, organizations like TNC. But Brazil did most of the work, and it's a damn good story. Now, it's one of those stories that the fight goes on forever with every passing day, and as population grows and as people rise out of poverty and their diets change, the pressure only continues. But that's where the action should be, or the attention should be focused in terms of protecting forests, in my view.
So, Mark, on that, so I got actually by text that came in. Thank you, Mark Rudolph. You said, okay, this is sort of standard fare, trees and credits. And I did promise that we wouldn't just focus on trees or criticize. We criticized Trump or the Canadian government, which has its tiny 2 billion tree commitment compared to the US commitment. But we've talked about trees and credits for 15 years. I want to hear about new and innovative ideas for nature-based solutions. So Mark, your opportunity, what's something that we can get excited about that isn't just about trees?
I think something cool out there right now that's controversial is soil-based sequestration. By the way, I should note, I've done a little advisory work for Indigo, one of the players. So just in the spirit of disclosure. But for a long time, environmental organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, said regenerative ag would capture and sequester soil. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time in the science, so I don't know how intensive that work was done. So then, lo and behold, the private sector is on this now. The private sector understands there's a business in supplying carbon solutions. So Indigo, a startup called Nori, N-O-R-I, Bayer, the giant company in Europe. There are different players now who are trying to figure out how to incentivize farmers, growers, to change the way they do business using cover crops, no-till farming, these kinds of things. A whole bunch of good outcomes will almost certainly happen. Less runoff, less fertilizer runoff into rivers, better economic outcomes for the growers themselves. It's a little bit murky though, and now there's another science debate about, well, wait a second, how much soil-based sequestration can really happen? How permanent will it be, et cetera? The verifying organizations are on the case. And I think it's a pretty healthy dynamic. I think we're gonna learn a lot very soon about how well soil-based sequestration will work. In my own view, I'm sure it will work in certain soils and situations. Whether it can be as grand as some of its champions hope, we don't know yet. I hope so. And the capital is being deployed to figure out how to measure and verify this quickly. Prospective buyers of offsets, all the guys in the news who say they're going to buy offsets, they're paying close attention. So stay tuned. I think that's soil is one interesting area. I mentioned coastal ecosystems for resilience, but also to capture carbon. Another thing on the mind of people these days is, hey, can we plant trees? Environmentalists have done such a bad job for less fortunate communities. We've done this globally and we've done it at home. So in the US, it's a dismal record. Good news, environmentalists now know that and want to do something about it. So the questions are arising, hey, can we bring green infrastructure into cities? It can be a source of investment. It can be a source of jobs. Trees might absorb particulate pollution in the air and improve health outcomes. And maybe there's a carbon angle there too. So there's a lot of stuff underway in all of these areas right now.
Great, thanks, that's helpful. And just, yeah, to point out in Canada, a big driver of nature-based solutions is also Indigenous reconciliation when we're talking about less fortunate communities. I don't think those of us on this panel today are particularly qualified to talk about that, but it might be something that we tackle in the future.
You know, Ed, I might just mention though, one of the most fun things I got to do in my job at the Nature Conservancy was to visit the Great Bear Rainforest a couple of times.
Cool.
And spend time with the indigenous people who talk about heroes, who have passed on so many opportunities that could really have exploited that extraordinary ecosystem. And yeah, then if those communities can benefit from any payment for ecosystem services, I think we should prioritize that kind of thing.
Great. Okay, So you've seen the second poll is launched, the closing poll. We swung some opinions away from
Yeah.
nature-based solutions, and they should be supported through policy and significant public spending. But I think that's just a consequence because we took away the I don't know option. So look forward to.
I think the one big lesson is this ever the right conversation for Canada, given the sort of scale of nature, the unmanaged ecosystem compared to the size of the country and the fossil industry? This is the place to have the conversation.
Great. Why don't we leave that as a concluding thought? Thank you, Mark. We're so
Thanks
grateful
so much.
that you joined us today. We learned a lot and really appreciate your time. We know that you're very busy.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun. Great discussion.
Thank you very
Keep
much.
up the great work.
Love to have you back. So a reminder, this episode is going to be available at energyversusclimate.substack.com for reviewing or as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It should be up in the next few days. You can always give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. That's energyvsclimate@gmail.com. We apologize to those of you who had questions around, say, biochar or volcanic rock or kelp as avenues or approaches for nature-based solutions. Sorry that we couldn't get to those. Thanks to our always very patient producer, Eva Voinigescu, and to the unparalleled Mika McFarlane for his webinar support. And we look forward to seeing you back here in a couple weeks' time. We'll give you the precise date when we know it, when we get to debrief the US election and the implications for Canadian energy and climate policy debates.
With Leah
Thanks.
Stokes. Bye-bye.
With Leah Stokes. That's right. With Leah Stokes, you won't want to miss that one.